Hi, everyone, and thanks for listening to the Admit One podcast, where we talk to students who have successfully navigated the college admission process and earned their ticket to college. We will be reflecting on the student's profile, which will include a discussion about their academic record, extracurricular activities, and application strategy. Today's guest is Sasha, who is a mechanical engineering major at Cornell University and has recently completed his freshman year. So Sasha, thanks so much for joining us. We're excited to talk to you a little bit about your application process and learn a little bit more about what got you admitted to Cornell at the end of the day. So Sasha, if you want to just start off, tell me a little bit about, kind of from a background standpoint, what were some of the things that you were involved with in high school? Like maybe even just start off, what is your background? Like what was your high school like? And tell me a little bit about some of your interests.
So I came from a fairly large public high school, but it was fairly advanced in terms of what it offered. So there was tons of AP classes, lots of clubs, and I would characterize myself as more academically focused. I wasn't actually involved in all that many extracurricular activities. For me, it was mainly taking the classes I knew I would need to succeed. And I wasn't even sure that I wasn't really even thinking about engineering, I think, until the end of sophomore year or the beginning of junior year. So it wasn't a very linear process, but I was always focused more on the academic classes. And I was involved so I was the founder and co-founder and co-vice or co-president. In high schools, people love to share duties
Exactly.
a lot. So co-founder and co-president of the Russian club at our school. And that was very fun junior year. And also very fun, but a lot more nuanced, I would say, senior year after 2022 started. And then besides that, I was also involved in debate. Freshman year, I was involved in school debate. And then after that, I transitioned over to outside of school debate organization. And I did that all throughout high school. Even when I became more focused on engineering, it was still something I enjoyed, so I continued doing it.
So you had talked about that you were primarily like academically focused throughout high school. Talk to me a little bit about like from a curriculum standpoint, like what were some of the classes that you took, and when did you start taking advanced courses?
Yeah, so at my school, you could take advanced courses from the very beginning. Of course, earlier on, advanced is more limited. So advanced might be an honors course because there is no, for example, like AP Algebra 2. So you will just take Algebra 2 honors. And so you basically, at the very beginning, you can go down one of three paths, which is like Algebra 2, Geometry, or Algebra 1. Of course, by the time you're entering high school, you may or may not already not be able to make that decision because it depends on what you already took. But you can certainly decide between honors and non-honors. And it's actually very important because it's very hard afterwards to switch which tracks you're on. So if you're unsure, I would always start on the more advanced track because it's always easier to drop down a level if it's too much than to try and ramp it up. So I started with Algebra 2. In terms of my further math track, I then did trig/pre-calculus sophomore year. And then junior year, I took BC calculus, which basically encompasses all of AB calc, but then goes a little bit further. And then senior year, my high school did something different where around half the people, even in the advanced track that took BC Calc, then decided to take AP Statistics. These were usually the people who were like, okay, I did all the hard classes, but I don't need any more math because my major isn't going to require it. And then people who were going into STEM, some of them, like me, decided to take multivariable calculus and linear algebra through a dual enrollment program. So a dual enrollment program is where you're kind of in between taking a high school class and a college class. So usually it's taught by the college and may or may not be taught at your high school, but regardless, it counts towards your high school credit. So it's kind of an in-between for some of those advanced classes, especially after you go through the AP class and you still want to take more. And then besides math, I took AP Physics 1 and then both mechanics and E&M for C. And then I took a lot of history AP classes. My school offered them, so I just took them. So I guess what I'm saying here is you can take a lot of classes that are advanced, both what you're planning to do and with what you're not planning to do, if you're up for it.
So
And
you hit on
yeah, so
you hit on
from
a couple
yeah.
of sorry, I feel like you hit on a couple of really important things that I want to touch and kind of come back to, because one of the things that you had said is the math class and the math track that you're on is really hard to change, and so especially for students and maybe parents that are have kids that are in middle school or even younger. One of the things that's a little wild is like the math class that you take in eighth grade can impact what you can do in ninth grade, 10th grade. And by the time you're a senior, and theoretically, it can impact like what programs you're admissible to when you get to college. So having an understanding of
Right.
what that math track looks like is really important at a young age. Did you like consciously, were you aware of that? Or was it just like you were strong in math and so you were put in the higher track, or how did that operate for you?
So I was actually not strong at math, and that's part of the reason I wasn't even considering engineering. Um, like I would say I became stronger at math towards again that pivotal moment between like sophomore and junior year. But I also came from a private middle school. So our high school had like one or two feeder middle schools that were public. And in that case, they would take that eighth grade qualifying exam that would determine what track they were on. And they wouldn't really be able to choose coming into high school what class they would take. It would already have been set for them. In my case, I wasn't particularly advanced at math. And I'd taken Algebra 1 in middle school. And I only started thinking about the track system right when I was about to enter high school. And so I self-studied geometry over the summer. And the only thing that saved me is because I was coming from a private school that didn't have that entrance exam thing. They didn't really have a set class for me. So I had the flexibility to choose and to self-study geometry and enter the class. But if I'd been in the same exact situation coming from a public school, so if I only took Algebra 1 in eighth grade, then I wouldn't even really have a choice. Like maybe there you could apply for an exception, but it would certainly be a lot harder. So in that sense, I kind of just got lucky in terms of where I was coming from. And I was able to self-study geometry and enter into the highest track of Algebra
Yeah,
2.
that's
But it
crazy.
depends. Yeah.
It's crazy because I mean, it also speaks to, you know, you had said, okay, I wasn't really necessarily like a math person through middle school, and then you know, it clicks a little bit more. You have the drive, obviously, to be able to self study for something and have the initiative to do that is really significant at the end of the day, and not everybody's gonna have that drive and that kind of the goal to get up and be in that different track, but the reality is like, you know, if you just had another year, you probably would have been okay. And there's, you know, tons of people out there who theoretically could evolve within their understanding of math and be ready for it later on. But yeah, the way that the system is set up is just really tough for
Yeah.
students to be able to do that. The other thing that you had talked about, which I think is a really, really important piece of information or piece of advice, and I talk to students all the time about this, is as you move forward, I see a lot of students who will take Calc BC as a junior, right? And like that's really significant. That's pretty rare for a student to be taking Calc BC in their junior year, and so they have this advantage as it relates to math. But then what they end up doing is they end up taking AP Stats because, to your point, it's kind of
Yeah.
like, oh well, I've done this highest level thing. Like I'm gonna try and like take it easy. And now I'm not trying to like completely diminish the, you know, the impact that stats has or that the rigor of AP Stats, but it's probably not as rigorous as AP Calc BC. And so I talk to students all the time about, okay, well, let's look for like dual enrollment courses. Let's look outside of your high school where you can take a course that's advanced, like linear algebra or multivariable. So talk to me about, from your standpoint, like how did you even conceptualize that? Like what was your mindset in identifying those dual enrollment courses? Was that something that like your school counselor gave you, or how did that come into play?
So first, I want to really quickly touch back on the AP Stats thing. There's something that really irked me about that class specifically. So yes, in general, like there weren't going to be any harder classes than taking multi and linear algebra the next year. But specifically with that, something that I found very interesting is that even the most simplest concept in AP Stats. So I haven't taken AP Stats. I have an abstract idea of some concepts though, like a standard deviation. And to derive the standard deviation formula, you have to use double or triple, I think it's double integrals to derive it. So from like the very basic building blocks of AP Stats, if you haven't taken some of the more advanced courses that you could have chosen to dual enroll in high school first and then say take stats in college, like I'm planning on taking, you're going to be facing a very formula based memorization class that is AP statistics. And in college, for example, my statistics class has a prerequisite of multivariable calculus. So I'm not even sure exactly like how a person who took AP stats is going to compare to a person who took a more rigorous version in college after having taken other more advanced math classes first.
Yeah, that's
So
interesting.
if you're choosing between the two, I would highly advise you to at least look into taking multi first. And that's a very specific piece of advice, but it's something I kind of retrospectively felt good about making. I wasn't really aware of it at the time.
So it also kind of like builds your
Yeah.
academic profile within high school, and then better prepares you as you're going to take it when you get to college, right? Is that fair?
Yeah. And then to answer your main question about how it came. So for in high school, at my high school, they had a very strong connection with the local college. So it wasn't very hard on my end. There were just a few forms I had to sign. And this was a regular thing. It happened every year. So it wasn't very, I didn't have to take a lot of initiative to reach out to that college and do it. But depending on where you are, if your high school does not have this regular offering of a dual enrollment class, you may have to do a lot more of the reaching out on your own and making sure that it aligns with your curriculum and that your high school is going to accept it and that any colleges you're thinking about are also going to accept it. So it might be more or less work just depending on what high school you're at and where you're thinking of applying.
So you're ending high school with essentially like a dual enrollment, so several advanced math courses, and then you're also taking several like high level physics courses and humanities courses. How many advanced, so AP or beyond, courses would you say you took throughout high school?
I think it was 9 AP classes, and then there were 2 classes that I took through dual enroll. So
Like 11.
I would say around 10, 11
Yeah.
total.
And that's a good number, like to
Yeah.
be somewhere between that 9 to 11. I think that's typically what I would recommend for students who are looking at like some of the most selective courses. And in a previous episode, we talked a lot about students trying to chase APs. And to me, it's less about like the number of AP classes that you take and more about the depth at which you've taken them. So for you, you've taken Calc BC, then you go beyond, you're taking multivariable, you take your physics, and then you take physics C. So you're doing it to a degree that's like beyond what a normal student would do, and that to me sounds like that's an elite representation of what your transcript would look like. And so when you're putting together like what your academic profile looks like talk to me a little bit about, are you thinking about this as far as college is concerned? Are you thinking about how this is going to how this is going to play out as far as like what it looks like for college? Or is it just like, I like these classes, I'm pretty good at them, I'm taking a more advanced level of them?
I think it was certainly a mixture. So I was definitely thinking of like maybe even at first a little bit too much. I was like, I need to get the 5. Like this is each test is the make or break, which it isn't, of course. But that was kind of what I was thinking of at the time. So I was super stressed out about each AP class I was taking. But it ended up helping me in the sense that after COVID started and a lot of schools went SAT optional, I feel like whether it was in a literal or kind of maybe not that well defined, but in a somewhat less degree, AP classes became much more important because that was kind of a way for schools to still gauge how good you are of a student in a standardized sense without the SATs. And then also, I'm going to Cornell right now, and if you're going to a UC, I think most UCs are very flexible with what they accept. So you can get like a 3, a 4, or 5 on APs and be fine. But for some classes, Cornell either requires a 5 or it doesn't even give you credit at all. So in that sense, I think it was very helpful that I put a pretty big emphasis on taking AP classes and taking them well and not just blowing off the exam.
Yeah. Yeah, we see this a lot because a lot of students, well, the high school is oftentimes dictates how influential a student believes the AP exam is going to be. And every college is going to review the AP exam differently. So I typically look at it as like, look, if you get a 4 or a 5, that's submittable. We feel pretty good about that. 3, we'll talk a little bit about it. And anything below, we'll probably not submit if possible. But every college, once you get there, will look at from a credit standpoint how things are evaluated differently based off of their own metrics. And so there is definitely some flexibility to be had if you come in with 20, 30 credits towards your degree. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you like graduate early or anything, but it certainly could mean that you have some flexibility within your major, maybe taking a little fewer classes, maybe you could double major, things like that. So and even if your college, the college that you're going to, doesn't take AP credits, or you have to get a 5, you never know, you may transfer, you never know how things operate moving forward. So I definitely encourage students to put as best of an effort as possible within those AP exams.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about outside of the classroom, some of the things that you're involved with. You had talked about the Russian club. So tell me a little bit about, you started that. So what did that stem from? What was kind of the thought process there?
So that started, the inkling of the idea started in the middle of sophomore year. Me and a friend who's also Russian basically there was a lot of other ethnic-based and nationality-based organizations at our school, not so much for Eastern Europe or Russia specifically. And so for the second half of sophomore year, we basically planned how we could form a Russian club, and also at the same time learn more about our own background, because I personally didn't know a whole lot about my background. And so junior year, we founded the club, a lot of paperwork. And also it's really how much you put into it. It can be very little work and almost no work if you just, form a paper not company, but club, and then just don't do anything. You can get away with it. You might even get away with tricking colleges with it, but it's certainly not fulfilling. And so we tried our best to actually have pretty regular meetings and have different events. So junior year was tricky because it was still online, and I think it was very hard online to have the same sort of engagement with clubs. So it was a lot of Zoom meetings. I think we had some virtual cooking lessons at some point where we partnered with another club that liked experimenting with food, and we did this 2 or 3 times throughout the year. We made different Russian dishes. So it was kind of a collaboration between a Russian club and a cooking club. And that was very fun. We watched Russian movies. So we did a lot of basically COVID-friendly events that year. And that year was, in that sense, harder, but in another sense, it was easier in the sense of what developments happened the following year. So going into senior year, we're really excited about, being back on campus. And for a club, it's much easier to operate on campus. And so we had a lot more in-person events. We still did the cooking, but we did it in person, and it's a lot more interesting to do it in person. We had trivia games in person, like Jeopardy style. And then in February, once the war started, that's when things took an interesting turn. So our club was never political, but it's hard to be the face of a country at your school that's in the news all the time and not in a good light. So that kind of forced us to self-reflect. And this is something I even mentioned, or I would have mentioned in some of my applications had my applications been submitted a few months later. So this didn't really affect my applications, but it was very interesting nonetheless to be a part of a Russian club during the time of the war. And we did do some stuff to discuss the war in our club in the best way possible.
So were you getting heat from it? Did people come at you and, be negative about it, or did you get any flack from people? What was the response from people maybe outside of the club?
So we didn't really experience any heat, but except from ourselves, I think we were just really concerned about the same thing that would have been perfectly acceptable the year before, such as advertising an event with the Russian flag because it has to do with our club. It became a lot more of a question of how do I do this without making it out of taste, essentially. So it became more self-concerning. Like, how do I do this? In terms of other people, we didn't really experience any negative, like
Yeah, yeah.
hate or anything, because I feel like people have been fairly tolerant. Unlike with other wars in the past, for some reason, I feel like people have been more tolerant of Russians. And
Yeah. No,
yeah,
it
so
is definitely interesting because I mean, you make a good point of like, normally you would have the Russian flag, and then all of a sudden it's sort of like, well, I guess we're not doing that today. So there's
yeah.
definitely some just the thought process that you have to go through as a student going into that. So let's get into like the actual application process a little bit. So you're entering your senior year. Talk to me a little bit about like strategically, are you thinking about you want to apply somewhere early decision? Are you applying early action? Like what does your list look like? Is Cornell at the top of your list? Are there other schools that are kind of in your mind higher? Like what was your thought process?
So I was actually part of a counseling organization that my parents signed me up for. And so I started fairly early. I think we started meeting with this organization at the end of sophomore year, and really the gear started turning junior year. So I started researching fairly early on, and it's good to do research fairly on because it's only 4 years of your life or more that you're going to be spending at this place, and it might not seem like a lot, but if you make the wrong choice, that's 4 years that you're going to have to kind of like go through it. So make sure that like you are starting fairly early, maybe not as early as the beginning of junior year, but you certainly don't want to, be coming to your first day of senior classes and still not even like having a list of the schools that you're going to apply to. So somewhere in that like junior year to junior year summer range, I would encourage you to, as like an applicant, to start thinking about where you're going. And then in my case specifically, I'd always been thinking about Cornell just because like I happen to be fortunate and have legacy there. So it's always like in the back of your mind in terms of strategy to apply early
Mm-hmm.
decision. And if you do have legacy and you're even somewhat considering that school, I highly encourage you to apply early, because if you don't, it will kind of negate any benefit you would have gotten, because like the whole reason schools accept you for legacy more often is because they think you're more likely to attend, so that'll increase their yield. And once you're more likely to attend, you'll be more enthusiastic about the school because you have family connections and you're more likely to donate. So they're not just doing this for some elitist reasons. It's actually they see it as worth it for them. So when you're applying early decision, you're kind of fitting that narrative that you're excited about it. But the moment you decide to not apply the early decision, you kind of show them that like that family thing didn't really mean much to you. And so they might be like, well, why are you applying to us regular decision if you're legacy? If you truly wanted to go to our school, you would have applied early decision. And so I don't know exactly what happens behind the scenes, but I would, if you are legacy and you want to go to a school, I would apply their early decision. And even if you are not legacy, if you are interested in the school, I would apply early decision. It would make your second semester of senior year much easier, less stressful. You might even get to submit less applications because some applications are due after early decision for other schools. But if you aren't sure, if you're stuck between 2 or 3 schools, I would say that's a good case where you might consider not applying early decision, because of course, early decision is binding unless you have some financial reasons why you wouldn't be able to attend the school you got into. And even then, from what I can tell, they'll do their best to meet your financial needs after admitting you. So
So
yeah, in most cases, I would apply
yeah,
them.
so you apply an early decision definitely gives you the greatest likelihood of admission, as schools know that you're going to have a high probability of matriculation there. Legacy is a big thing right now in the news as people talk a lot about like what does legacy admission look like, especially on the heels of the affirmative action case at just has recently come out, and so the legacy admission component of within the review perspective is probably going to change in the next couple of years, and I think certainly some schools have actually just gotten rid of the idea of legacy admission or that being a part of the review process. So it will be interesting to see with the affirmative action case. if race cannot be part of the review process, then can legacy be a part of the review process? And that's kind of opposite ends of the spectrum in some ways. But I think that'll certainly be interesting to see how schools handle that moving forward. Because to your point, the schools have a high probability of you enrolling. They know you have a historical background there, and so they're trying to keep these numbers as low as they possibly can. They want their admit rates to be low, and so they want to admit students that they think have a high probability of actually enrolling. So you apply early decision. Are you looking at other schools for early action at that point, or is Cornell pretty high up on the list for you?
So I had like this internal debate in the few months leading up to when I was submitting my applications. Essentially, I was like, is there a school that I like enough that I want to risk not applying to Cornell early decision? So that was tricky for me because Cornell early decision, like you mentioned, in a lot of schools, early decision does give you a higher chance of getting in. And I think in Cornell, it's like 20% early decision and like something less than 10%.
Yeah, like probably 7% like regular or something. Yeah.
So it is a big difference. And so it's, you do want to consider applying the early decision, but at the same time, there are schools like UCLA where they don't have early decision. But if I did apply to Cornell or the early decision and got in, I wouldn't have a chance to change my mind essentially. And so it's something you have to really think about, maybe not at the beginning of your application process, but before you submit, you have to be sure that you're happy with what you're doing. And so certainly even with me, I was not sure going into it. And I was thinking of schools like UCLA and other schools that, again, I wasn't really thinking of applying anywhere else early instead of Cornell. It was more of the question of, do I preclude myself from going somewhere by applying early decision to Cornell?
Yeah.
But at the end, I decided that I like Cornell enough that if I get in, like that's already good. Like I shouldn't be worried about other schools that I didn't get into, and I'd be more than happy there.
Yeah, so. I think sometimes there's like this fear of like I'm going to make the wrong decision or something like that. And I always, in your example is a good one to use. It doesn't have to be like a Cornell, but any school that you have as like one of your top 2 or 3 schools overall that you feel like you'd be really excited to go to. Let's just take the example that you just used, right? In a worst case scenario for you, if you had applied, which you did, you apply to Cornell, you get into Cornell, worst thing that can happen is that you don't hear back from UCLA. You don't know if you got in there, right? That's like the worst case. In that worst case scenario, you have to go to Cornell, one of the best schools in the world, right? On the other end of things, if you didn't apply ED, worst case scenario is you don't get into UCLA, you don't get into Cornell because you didn't apply early decision. And now you didn't even give yourself the greatest chance to get into one of those 2. So when I talk to students, I always think about like, look, you've got to kind of hedge your bets a little bit. And sometimes you want to gamble, but also if you've got a couple of schools that you feel pretty great about and you're excited about, if the worst case scenario is you don't get to hear back from all the other ones, I think your ego is going to be okay at the end of the day. So I definitely get that decision.
Yeah, and there is this, as you mentioned, game theory component to college applications that can keep you on your toes, and yeah, it's pretty fun too.
Absolutely. So I want to pull up and talk a little bit about your essays. So let's start with your main essay. Talk to me a little bit about what your thought process was when approaching the main essay, and what was kind of the main message that you're trying to convey.
Yeah, so this was when so actually with my college counseling organization, the strategy they gave me is to do the Common App essay last. So most people are like, this is the most important essay, I need the most time on it, I'm going to start with it first. And the reason I was advised to do this last is because you're writing so many more supplemental essays that if you end up writing something really great that you want not just this school to see, but all the schools, at least on the Common App, to see, you can just copy and paste it into the Common App later and then change that one supplemental instead of doing the opposite where you're kind of stuck. So that's what I did. I ended up writing the Common App as one of my later essays. And I didn't end up using something I wrote about elsewhere, but I kind of had already gotten used to the idea of just throwing down a bunch of ideas. And also because I realized that I'd already written my supplementals about the technical stuff. So most of my engineering and like brag sheet about how I've done in high school and all my STEM courses, that came more in my supplemental essays. And so I was like, I could kind of repeat myself again in the Common App essay, but I was really like pressing myself to think about what other cool things about me exist that you wouldn't know unless I wrote about it in an essay. And one of the, I don't even know, like, I don't know if it was the cliche of like, it just suddenly popped into my brain and I just jotted down as much as I could. I'd like to think that's how it was. I don't remember exactly, but I do remember that this idea came into my head when I was talking with my parents. So talking with people who also know you is a good idea to kind of generate thoughts. And I remember that like I've always been obsessed with borders. I haven't really connected it to anything else, but it's just been some random fact about me that I thought was really cool. And, you know, a bunch of other people are applying, but I don't think many of them are obsessed with borders as much as I am. And I knew it's something that I was obsessed with, which is good because there's a lot of stuff I know about this and it does define me in some way. And so it's the perfect type of thing to feed into a interest-based Common App prompt. And so I wasn't really worried about anything. I just kind of wrote it. It was the essay that I revised, I want to say the least as a result, because it was closest to the heart. I wasn't really trying to stretch anything, or I kind of just wrote it from my heart. And that's why I really liked the way it turned out. For context, the prompt is basically talking about, or my answer is kind of talking about how international borders are, on the one hand, very arbitrary, and from a natural point of view, not very real, but from like a societal point of view, they're very real and have very real consequences. And I also talk about how I came to like borders, what that causes me to do, and how it's kind of branched off into my various interests in geopolitics. And likewise, that again, they have very little to do with engineering, but it's just another facet to me that I thought colleges might be interested in.
Yeah, I think I think this is you make a very good point, and I think it's hard sometimes for students to think about the whole picture. So I love not writing the main essay first when you're starting this process, because it can feel really daunting. It can feel overwhelming. It can feel like, how am I going to get my whole life story into 650 words? Because as a student, you've never applied to college before. So you're not really aware of what else is going to be included in the application. And so to be able to start with a couple of different ideas and think a little bit more about what are the pieces of my puzzle and how am I going to convey those things, I think that that's a really critical part of what this process looks like. And then the other thing too that you made a very good point on is within the supplementals, you're going to be able to talk about more of the like technical stuff, the specific elements of your profile, what you've done within the classroom, within different research experiences or clubs that you've been a part of, or whatever it may be. And so to be able to focus on sort of more of a philosophical approach in the way that you think, and I think you do a really good job in this one of talking about, it's a demonstration that you're able to think critically, that you're open-minded, that you're viewing the world in different ways, that you're learning, those kinds of things. I think you have a great line in here towards the end where you say, international borders have already shaped my outlook on the world. As globalization erodes the barriers between countries, I've realized the value of opening up my own previously gated sense of identity and culture to the experience of others. And I think it's just a really nice way of saying, like, the whole essay is about the idea of borders, and to your point, like, that they are arbitrary, but then they have this very real effect on the way that people live. And so you also have your own borders that you've tried to kind of change and shift. And I think from a narrative standpoint, that just gives a really insightful, and it does to a certain degree align with, you started the Russian club. So I think that has a tie to it as well. You want to do engineering, and you have a high level of math and all of these kinds of things. You've done advanced physics, but then you also have this other side of you that's more understanding of cultures, communities, globalization, and things like that. And so I think tying all of those things in is a really nice piece for you comparatively to what the rest of your application looks like.
And like, I felt really proud about this essay. So that's one thing you can kind of use to gauge how well you wrote one of your essays, is just like, how proud do you feel? Do you feel like you just wrote what you were expected to write? Or do you have like some sort of internal glow reading it again? Like I just had now, even a year later, rereading it. So make sure you're rereading it and thinking like, does do I feel proud of what I wrote, or am I just writing it for the prompt?
Yeah, I love that. This is you're not the first person that we've interviewed to say that, and I think that that's like a really, really important piece of advice for students as they start writing this process. Is that like it should be something that you're proud of and something that represents, you and your background and your experiences and all of those kinds of things. And so I think that's a huge piece, is that it's not just what, because I think a lot of times students will write what they think an admission officer wants to read, which doesn't even make any sense, because 9 times out of 10, you have no idea who the person is that's actually reading the application. But instead, it should be something that you're proud of and that fits with what your story and experience are. And so I think that's a great piece of advice. I want to also bring up the supplemental that you submitted to Cornell as well, and kind of give people a view of this, and talk to me a little bit about what I took away from this one was that you were really knowledgeable about Cornell, and I think you did a really good job of tying the things that you've done into what you will take advantage of at Cornell. So talk to me about like what the research process is for you in preparing for an essay like this one. And
So I will say that,
let me also
yeah,
just
sorry,
say,
go ahead.
just for people who might be listening, the prompt is essentially, how do you see yourself becoming a part of the Cornell engineering community? That's the first one.
Yeah, so I will say for prompts like this, it's definitely more standard, and I feel like it was more cookie cutter. So, I mean, I think it was a decent essay overall, but I will say I wasn't as proud of it because it was. I mean, if you look up even samples on similar topics, you'll see the structure is very similar, and that's not a coincidence. That's because I kind of used that structure as I was researching. So in this case, I kind of interpreted it as like a chance to show that I looked at the school, and they know that too. Like part of this is just they don't want people applying without doing their research beforehand, and so like I am very specific in this essay, but that's because I'm trying to convey that I did my research, and so I essentially like perused the website of Cornell Engineering, and tried to find interesting things that I could see myself doing. Again, you're not bound to do them. This is kind of just like an exploratory essay. But I did try and do my best to not just grab the first thing that came up, because not only did I think that they were like, if everyone took the first thing, then everyone would write about the same thing. But also I kind of wanted to see something that like I would actually consider doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did talk about, the project teams. And I actually didn't even realize just how important project teams are within the Cornell engineering community. So if you're interested in Cornell specifically or engineering specifically, they're a very big part of not just the, academic culture at Cornell, but they're a very good big part of the social culture as well. You meet a lot of your good friends on these project teams. And so I kind of wrote this essay having like grabbed that off the internet, but I didn't even really internalize exactly how important it was. So, and a lot of these things you won't really be able to truly grapple with or understand until you actually attend the school. But you want it to the best of your abilities, like make sure you understand what you're getting into. And it's actually funny, I'm looking at the project teams that I wrote about specifically here. And I actually applied to all 3 of those. And then I also applied to one other project team. And that was the one that I ultimately went with. So it's pretty funny to me to see that. But I do think to a degree I stayed pretty true with the message of what I was writing about.
I think you also, because you had mentioned earlier that, you started the research on what your college list would look like a little bit earlier in the process. And I think that that's, sometimes I feel like when people hear the word research, or we're going to research colleges, there's like I don't want to do this. Like, it's just another thing I have to do. But like the way that I look at it is, this is a once in a lifetime deal. Like, you get to literally live anywhere you want in the world and learn about anything you want to learn about. Like, that's crazy. That's never going to happen again, probably in your life. And so the research that you're doing shouldn't be feel taxing or draining, or that it's not something you want to do. It should be exciting, and you get to learn about who you're going to be taking classes with and what types of things you're going to be doing, what student organizations. So there's so many different elements to it, and I think you have in this, your third paragraph to me is the one that kind of jumps out, because the key for me in these essays, and it's hard within 200 words, but you're basically trying to say, what have I done in high school? What is my experience? What is the school offering? And how am I going to take advantage of that offering and build off of the things that I've done? And so in your third paragraph, you say, building on my summer aircraft model validation project at Cornell, I plan to join Professor Williamson's group to validate and develop vortex models for airplanes. Through this research, I hope to reduce the amount of fuel burned by taxiing aircraft, waiting for the wake turbulence from departing aircraft to pass. This will reflect Cornell's goal of carbon neutrality by 2035 and my own desire to help offset global warming. So, like, to me, that's a perfect way to say, here's something I've done, here's something that's happening academically, that it aligns with the goals of the institution, and I'm going to be able to take advantage of it. So really, to me, those are the types of things that you're trying to identify. And it's not just simply, I want to be part of this standard research group, or I want to be part of this. It's like there are specific elements that align with what your background is.
Right. And of course, like, this is research, and you might not like the term research, especially in high school. And like, I immediately think of like I'm about to write a research essay. But like, you can also just think about it as like, you're doing your shopping for colleges, and this is going to be the most probably expensive shopping decision you've ever made in your life, and the most long-term one. So if you want to think about it in another way, you're not doing research, you're making sure that you're purchasing the right thing for yourself.
Yep, I like that. So then the second essay we can touch on quickly, where it's similar in some ways, but it says, how do you see yourself contributing to the diversity and inclusion of the Cornell engineering community? What is the unique voice that you would bring to the Cornell engineering community? And then talk to me a little bit about how you kind of approach this one.
Yeah, so I mean, when you think about diversity, you can think about it in many ways. I mean, obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is like your ethnicity and nationality. You could talk about other stuff too. So it could be, and I think here I decided not to talk about only one part, because there's a lot of things that you don't initially think about with diversity, such as diversity of thought, right? So I do talk about being Jewish and being Russian, but I also talk about how I learned and shared my diverse ideas in debate. So essentially, you can write about pretty much anything, even if you're like, I'm not diverse, or I'm very cookie cutter. There's certainly, like, there's 8 billion people on the world, and no two people are fully identical. So there's something about you that makes you diverse. There's something about you that would help the school. And at Cornell, like, our engineering school is very diverse, especially in terms of gender. I think we actually might even have more females than males, which is like almost unheard of. So they are looking for diversity. And if you can write about something or a group of things that sticks out about you, whether it be ethnicity or something you've done or elsewise, it can really make you stand out. You're trying to show like what's marketable about you. And in this case, I talked about how, I was kind of keeping up with the news at this time, and I heard about this like incident in the ISS, which is the space station that orbits the Earth, and how it involved like a team of people from both Russia and the US these are engineers to fix the glitch. So it's very directly connected to what I was writing about in terms of engineering. It's connected to what I was writing about my Russian background. And I basically said like, look, that's one of the cases in which I, as a Russian American, would be useful as an engineer in your program.
Yeah.
So you do want to tie it to not only what you are as like an ethnicity or background, but why that matters and how that can tangibly help in your later life.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that you touch on in this essay that are really kind of pillars for these types of questions that I talk to students a lot about. Is that it's not necessarily like like you said, it doesn't have to be whatever your standard viewpoint or perspective of diversity is, which might be like race, ethnicity, that kind of thing. It's also more about your understanding of the global world, about collaboration, about your ability to think critically. and how do you interact with others? And you have a good line here where you say the importance of mutual understanding and collaboration between people of different backgrounds was recently demonstrated in the multinational response by Russian and American engineers when stabilizing the ISS after a glitch in the Nuaka model. So I think it's this idea of talking about like, okay, why is collaboration important? Why is diversity important? Why is my perspective going to be of value when I attend here? And I think that at the end of the day is really what you're trying to get across, and what schools are hoping to see is that they're going to bring in a diverse community with people who think critically and are innovative and can collaborate and all of those kinds of things. Cool. Well, that's super helpful. Now we've got a couple more minutes, but I want to end or not end, but think about now looking back a little bit on your college application process. And if you don't have anything, that's okay. But is there anything that you feel like you would do differently, or that you wish you maybe had known as you went through it? Now that you're kind of reflecting back.
So I would say, like, don't take yourself that seriously. You should certainly take the application process as a whole seriously, but at the same time, especially if you're starting to think about this like junior year, like you're still in high school, you should be doing research and learning about the colleges. But at the end of the day, like you should not be so stressed out about this, that this is affecting your life right now, because college is part of your life, but so is high school. And I think it's really easy for people to just turn off their high school switch the moment they start applying and only think about college. But you're going to have time to do that later. And college is important, but you also want to keep being a person in high school and not become an application robot.
Yep.
And I think that's certainly something I noticed like around me. And I think myself too, it's really hard to filter out college applications once you're in that season and mode. But just remember that you're still a human. The people who are going to be reading your essays are probably, outside walking right now. They're doing their own thing. So you should also do your own thing every once in a while.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, because the reality is like, yeah, you go to college once, but you only go to high school once too. And so, you need to enjoy the experience that you have and be involved and be present in that moment. And the ironic thing is, in my experience, having done this for 15 years or so, the students who are most involved within and present in the moment and taking advantage of the things that are around them and building new things and really investing themselves within their high school experience, those are the ones who are going to be most successful within the college application process, as opposed to the students who are doing things that are only and purely for college. And I talk to students and families all the time about, like, look, I want you to understand what your overall profile looks like and how you're going to submit that to colleges. And I think that that's important for people of any age. And at different points, it's like, what are you doing, and how is that going to impact the things that you're going to do in the future? But it's also important to be present in that moment and to be able to take advantages of the things that are available to you and learn from the people that are with you throughout high school. So I think that's great advice.
Right. Yeah. And like it also probably helps you with like not crashing later on with senioritis, because you weren't doing everything for college. And then it'll also help you in college because you weren't doing everything for college, and now in college thinking, well, what do I do now? I'm in college.
Exactly.
So I think it's very important, as you mentioned.
Totally. Well, Sasha, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences and some of your thoughts and advice with students. I know it's super helpful for students to be able to hear from somebody who's gone through it and come out successfully at the other end, and to learn from those experiences. So thanks so much for taking the time. For everybody who is listening, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share through all the platforms that we have. And if you are a student that has an interesting story and feels like they might be a good guest on the podcast, please feel free to reach out. We look forward to working and speaking with many of you every week. So thanks again, Sasha, for taking the time, and thanks everybody for joining in.
Thank you for having me.